Introducing YouTube memberships, a fun way to support the channel while getting some exclusive perks. Click the join button to become a member now and get benefits like badges next to your name on videos, behind-the-scenes photos, advantages during the live trivia game, discounts on merchandise, private one-on-one video chats, the ability to request future video topics, and exclusive 8 to 10 minute videos on the history of the NFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. A while ago, I made a video about this game right here, and the controversy that followed in 2000 with the Seattle Seahawks. If you want to go more in-depth about the matter at hand and learn more about it, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, to make a long story short, the Seahawks were absolutely livid, and understandably so, about how the schedule makers treated them, because they believe that the NFL put the Seahawks at a significant competitive disadvantage. The Seahawks had to fly out to Kansas City for their Monday Night Football game, and then, the following week, had to fly all the way out to Carolina on a short week to take on the Panthers, with this all coming in a 3-game stretch where the Seahawks played 3 road games, going back to back away from Husky Stadium. Their mileage to go from Seattle to Kansas City, back to Seattle, and then to Carolina, and back to Seattle in the span of a week, blew by every other team in football, as they were put in an almost impossible situation, which is why it's not too surprising that the Seahawks followed up their game against the Chiefs with a poor performance and a 26-3 loss to the Panthers. And it would be one thing if the league treated every team this way, where it was complete luck of the draw. But what made this situation frustrating was that it seemed like the Seattle Seahawks were the only team in the league that was impacted by this. Every other team that had to play on the road on Monday Night Football either played their next game at home, had a bye week, or their next game was on the road in the same time zone. Not Seattle, which had to go from the Pacific time zone to the Central time zone, back to the Pacific time zone, to get ready for their game in the Eastern time zone, and then fly back to the Pacific time zone, all in the span of just a few days. It was brutal, and the fact that Seattle was the only team treated that way really grinded the gears of head coach Mike Holmgren and members of the organization. Well, guess what, folks? We have another example of that today, where a team was put at a significant disadvantage because of the scheduling gods. And they were, quite literally, the only team to receive this disadvantage. Because in the middle of the 2003 season, this man right here, Pittsburgh Steelers head coach Bill Cowher, was fuming, and understandably so, about how the Monday Night Football schedule was looking. Because his Steelers received, shall we say, less than preferential treatment when compared to the rest of the league. We know that Cowher is not afraid to speak his mind, and is not afraid to go off when it is appropriate. You can learn more about a time he did that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And this controversy that we're going to talk about today was no exception to the rule. Because this is the story behind one of the craziest scheduling controversies in Monday Night Football history, and maybe the biggest controversy on Monday Night Football throughout the entire 2003 season. Before I talk about the actual controversy in question, and what had Cowher and the Steelers up in arms, and understandably so, we need some context to understand how exactly the game itself went. It's November 17th, 2003. It's week 11 of the NFL season. And as we're heading toward the end of the month at Thanksgiving, we've got an absolutely big Monday Night Football game on our hands over at 3Com Park between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the San Francisco 49ers. This was a big game for both teams, aside from the fact that this was a nationally televised game on ABC, which always raises the stakes, and the fact that this game got some extra attention because the 49ers were retiring the jersey of longtime safety Ronnie Lott at halftime of this contest. Both of these teams badly needed a win to keep their season alive. For the 49ers, they enter at 4-5, having yet to string together 2 consecutive wins. They're 2.5 games back of a wild card, so if they lose this one to drop to 3 back, you can kiss their season hopes goodbye, and you can kiss head coach Dennis Erickson's chances of making it to the promised land in his first year completely out the door. As for the Steelers, the bad news is that, quite frankly, this season has stunk for them. They're 3-6, they're on pace to have one of their worst seasons in years, and they're worse since the 1988 campaign, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And thanks to an anemic offense and a porous defense, they're one of the worst teams in football at this point. The good news, though, is that the AFC North stinks. The Ravens and Bengals are tied for the lead at 5-5, and the Browns are in third at 4-6. So if the Steelers win this game, they're only a game out of the division with 6 to play, which is a pretty good spot to be in all things considered. Lose this one, though, and your season is pretty much toast, barring a complete miracle. As for how this game turned out, well, let's just say that this was one of those games that the Steelers would love to forget. And this was one of those games that just about summed up their entire season, because everything about this one for the team was ugly with a capital U. The 49ers won this one convincingly, taking it by a final score of 30-14, with the Steelers never leading at any point in the contest, and with the game not even necessarily being that close, seeing as the Niners led at 30-7 midway through the fourth quarter. It doesn't help when the 49ers scored 14 points in a 14-second stretch during the third quarter. I'll say that much. Tim Rattay was not exactly a great quarterback, but against this Steelers team, he had the best game of his career, going 21 for 27 with 254 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a passer rating of 130.6. That was the highest rating of his career in any game at the time, and would eventually become the second highest rating after it got eclipsed by performance on opening day of the 2005 season against the St. Louis Rams. The 49ers dominated on the ground, with the Steelers having no answers for the 1-2 punch of Garrison Hurst and Kevin Barlow, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. If we exclude the 2 kneel-downs by Rattay at the end of the game for obvious reasons, San Francisco had 170 yards on 30 carries, averaging just under 6 yards per carry. You're going to win a lot of games by doing that. And the Steelers turned it over twice, while also being incredibly ineffective on the ground, picking up just 44 yards on 2.2 yards per carry. This was just one of those games that felt ugly from the start, and really highlighted how much Pittsburgh's offense and defense had struggled up until that point in the season. So obviously, this loss stinks for the Steelers. There's no two ways around it. This loss essentially ended their season and any hopes that they had at winning the absolutely terrible AFC North. But at least the Steelers would get to fly back home and would get to play next in front of their home fans, not having to waste another day of traveling. I mean, it makes sense as to why that would be the case. The NFL made an extremely conscious effort of ensuring that every team that played on the road the previous week on Monday Night Football was at home the following week. And it made sense as to why that was the case. Traveling on the road to play on Monday Night Football means you're not getting back until the early hours of the morning on Tuesday. Now, if you have to waste another day traveling on Saturday when you're already behind the 8 ball, that puts you at a significant competitive disadvantage. During the 2003 season, there were 16 games to take place on Monday Night Football, with 1 game in each of the first 16 weeks of the season. This means, since there were technically no neutral site games, although I say that as a technicality, since the Chargers-Dolphins game was moved from San Diego to Tempe, Arizona due to wildfires, there were 16 games where there was a visiting team. Of those 16 games, the following week, 13 of those teams played at home, and got to play in front of their home fans after a short week. 2 of those teams had a bye, so they got to rest up for the week. And if you do the math, that's 15. 15 out of 16 teams either played at home the following week after playing on Monday Night Football, or they didn't play at all. And I'm sure you might be able to see where this one is going. Because there was one team that was quite simply not afforded that luxury. And that team was none other than the team you've been watching this whole time get absolutely smoked at the hands of the San Francisco 49ers. It was none other than the Pittsburgh Steelers. Because after flying all the way out to San Francisco and traveling across the country, they then had to play a game on a short week of rest on the road the following week, as their next game was on the road against the Cleveland Browns. Even if the Steelers played at home, they were somewhat screwed over by the scheduling as it was. For some perspective, here's a look at how long every team had to travel round trip for their Monday Night Football game in the 2003 season. The Steelers, by virtue of going from the Eastern time zone to the Pacific time zone, and by going from Pennsylvania to San Francisco, already had the longest travel. They were one of just 2 teams to have to travel 3 time zones to play a Monday night game. Round trip, the Steelers were traveling over 5,100 miles to get from San Francisco and back, well above the average for Monday Night Football teams that year of about 2,600 miles. The Steelers were doubling the average as it was. And now, you add the fact that they're on the road the following week and have to travel some more, wasting another day to do that? That seems incredibly unfair, especially because the game was on the West Coast, so they're not even landing in Pittsburgh until many people have started their workday on Tuesday. Needless to say, as you can probably expect, this man right here, Steelers head coach Bill Cowher, was absolutely livid and outraged about this. This put the team in a significant and understandable competitive disadvantage. And while the road game in question wasn't too far away, as it was in Cleveland, so it's within driving distance if you wanted to do that, it was the entire principle of it all. And the fact that the Steelers, after having the longest trip for any team this season on Monday Night Football, somehow became the only team to then play on the road the following week. Said Cowher quite bluntly on the whole situation, "I don't see how there's any justification for that." Steelers owner Dan Rooney spoke with the league when the schedule came out, and he was disappointed but understanding of the situation, saying, "I talked to the league about it, and they said that's why they put us in Cleveland, because it's close. We're not making a big thing about it." Cowher, on the other hand, was not as nice, saying, "I think Mr. Rooney's too nice to them. I told Mr. Rooney that too." He wanted Rooney to make a fuss about this, since it was a huge competitive disadvantage having to travel so much when no other team in the league that season had to do so. And while Cowher wasn't about to make any excuses for how brutal this stretch was, he was very clear in saying that there was no reason whatsoever for the schedule to be that way. And that is especially true when you realize that the NFL schedule makers could have made this a complete non-problem and a complete non-story. The Steelers and Browns, by virtue of being divisional opponents, played each other twice in the 2003 season, with the meetings coming in Week 5, that game being in Pittsburgh, and Week 12, which came in Cleveland. Why couldn't you just flip the 2 dates for those games? Have the Steelers-Browns game take place in Pittsburgh in Week 12, and the Steelers-Browns game in Cleveland take place in Week 5. There's no scheduling conflict either with the Cleveland Indians if that was what it came down to, since the Indians season was done the final week of September, and the first Steelers-Browns game was taking place in October. Again, if you do that, pretty easy fix, and it's a complete non-story. But as it is, yeah, the Steelers definitely got screwed over by this schedule. The funny part in all of this is that despite the short week, and despite the added travel that no other team in the league had to do when playing on Monday Night Football, and despite the clear competitive disadvantage that they were at, when the Steelers played their next game, which was this game right here on the road against the Cleveland Browns, the Steelers still won the battle, and took it by a final score of 13-6. It wasn't pretty by any means, especially since the Steelers' offense stagnated like crazy by mustering up just 168 yards of total offense and by going just 2 for 14 on third down. But it didn't need to be. The Steelers forced 5 turnovers and got 3 sacks, and the defense did its job. Because as bad of a season as 2003 was for the Steelers, it was still a really bad season for the Cleveland Browns too. At the very least, the Steelers clearly did not suffer the same fate that the Seahawks did in 2000, when they were at the competitive disadvantage and had to play the Panthers on the road and got absolutely annihilated in one of the worst offensive performances in franchise history. So I would call that a win. But it's just bizarre that the NFL and the schedule makers even allowed a situation like this to transpire in the first place, especially when there was such an easy fix. Whether you think Cowher was justified in complaining is up to you, and you can let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. But the Steelers were already at a disadvantage, having to travel out to San Francisco and travel further than any team in the league had to do on Monday Night Football. And then, to add insult to injury, they had to do something that no other team in the NFL had to do by playing on the road the next week. Because during the 2003 season, when the Pittsburgh Steelers wanted preferential and special treatment from the NFL, this isn't quite what they had in mind. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.